Good morning, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. So for all of you who had tuned in last night, we had a big thunderstorm and apparently the internet connection disappeared as we were meditating. And hopefully this morning we won't have any problems. But if we do, now you know why. All right, so welcome to Nancy, Aaron, Geeta, Upasika Tara, Mikey, Michael, Kumu, Jayanta, Gorgel. Welcome to all of you friends. So since we missed our meeting last night was interrupted, this morning we have quite a bit of some ground to cover, but it's all for... We'll try our best. Let's do it. We can do it. All right. So this is, as we were saying, a series on the Sapasava Sutta, so Majjhima Nikaya 2, all the taints. So we have covered so far taints to be removed by seeing, by using, and by restraining. And we'll go through the rest of the sutta this morning. So we'll try and do our best. All right, welcome to Anita. Good to see you. All right, so we can start by paying homage to our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham dhammam sangham namasami. So the Buddha continues by giving instructions to us in the Sapasava Sutta. And he says, what taints bhikkhus should be abandoned by enduring? Here a bhikkhu reflecting wisely bears cold and heat, hunger and thirst, and contact with gadflies, mosquitoes, wind, the sun, and creeping things. He endures ill-spoken, unwelcome words and arisen bodily feelings that are painful, racking, sharp, piercing, disagreeable, distressing, and menacing to life. While taints, vexation, and fever might arise in one who does not endure such things, there are no taints, vexation, or fever in one who endures them. These are called the taints that should be abandoned by enduring. So we see that the Buddha here talks about both, the form and the formless, so to speak. So the elements that we, especially if we are meditating outside, but also inside, actually. So all the different things that we're experiencing with the body, whether it's cold and heat, or whether we're interacting with all the different cute little creatures, perhaps when we have our the inspiration of going to meditate outside, we have this kind of like Google image of peace in our mind, and we're like, oh, so beautiful, so lovely. I remember I had one of those moments actually when I was traveling in Thailand, that I woke up in the morning and it was very early at dawn, and I see this beautiful lake where we were, the monastery where we're at, had this beautiful lake, and there was a Bodhi tree. So I was like, oh yes, I'm gonna go and like meditate by the lake underneath the Bodhi tree. Very peaceful, oh, so sweet. I'm gonna attain awakening just like the Buddha. And then I go there, and yeah, it was like lovely for the first perhaps 1 minute, 2 minutes, until the mosquitoes of the town realized that, as Ajahn Brahm says, that there was a new restaurant in town. So the word spread. Everybody, all the mosquitoes were like, oh yes, there's an Italian, restaurant called Ayya Soma right there by the lake, underneath the Bodhi tree. And it was so painful, right? With all the different mosquitoes coming and biting and having a big feast and calling all their friends to have a big feast. Well, the Buddha encourages us to endure those taints, all that, greed, hatred, and delusion that appears in the mind. But also perhaps, it doesn't have to be the mosquitoes, but it can just be just, when we're sitting in meditation, after a while, then the body will start aching. And we're going to have all those bodily feelings that the Buddha describes as painful, racking, sharp, piercing, disagreeable, distressing, and menacing to life. If you've gone to a meditation retreat, then you definitely know that that is the experience of pretty much anyone, right, who meditates for long periods of time. But there is a certain point where it feels like the body is about to fall apart, right? We're like, oh dear, the body is about to destroy, even though I'm just only sitting. And so we endure, we should endure all those painful bodily sensations, because realistically, the percentages actually of the chances that one can get hurt while just sitting are very, very low. So most of the time, except in some very few rare situations where it's actually quite clear the difference in the mind. If we are in tune with our feelings, we can tell the difference between, the sort of complaining that our mind does. So the second art of like, oh, I don't like this, I don't want this, it has to stop. Or actually the body getting injured. And then once again, here it's summer in New Jersey, so it can be very hot and humid. So we can complain, it's so hot and humid. And then when it gets cold, it's so cold and freezing. And it's, that's never really the perfect temperature. That's correct, actually. It's never the perfect temperature. It doesn't exist as such perfect temperature. It's always somewhat dissatisfying. So we just train ourselves to, just be with it. It is fine. It's perfect, just the way just the way it is, right? And if we're experiencing hunger, maybe we're doing the practice of 1 meal a day, or only 2 meals a day, or whatever it is, rather than 3 or multiple millions, right? Yeah, we endure hunger, and we endure thirst as well. Perhaps we're meditating in the middle of the forest, and there is no water close by, water fountain, or we have finished the water in our water bottle. So all of these things are all of these taints that appear in the mind should be eliminated, should be abandoned just by simply enduring, instead of getting into our usual habits and tendencies of mind of complaining and wanting for things to stop. And this, by the way, as we said, it's not only, the different elements and different sentient beings that we're dealing with, so physical sensations, but also mental. So there's nothing, perhaps, if someone starts yelling at us or saying unpleasant things to us, there's not really like, nobody is hurting our body. So we're getting a little bit in the formless realm, as I like to call it, a different type of formless. We usually use the formless, this word for other, for meditative states. But, we can say that actually words are formless, yet they have a really strong, impact in our mind. And sometimes it's more difficult to bear with unwelcome words or ill-spoken words than with bodily unpleasant feelings, right? If someone tells us how bad and how awful of a person we are, it can be very hurtful, right? It can be very distressing. If someone yells at us, insults in the middle of the street, that can be quite upsetting, right? And so the Buddha, remember, he encourages us, not only in this sutta, but throughout the canon, to keep our mind sane, keep our mind protected. There's the famous simile of the saw that no matter, actually he gets into the physical too, no matter if anyone, starts cutting any piece of our body, if our mind then goes to hating that person, then we're not practicing the teachings of the Buddha. And of course, that's easier said than done. So we need to keep in mind that we are unenlightened beings and it will be difficult, but we should have that right intention and we should be cultivating that. Because of course, especially if one lives in community, there will be a lot of giving and receiving admonishment. And we will be unskillful at giving admonishment, and we will be even more unskillful in receiving admonishment. In fact, you can see the instructions of the Buddha to give admonishment, they're pretty short, and the instructions to receiving admonishment are really quite long and intensive. Actually, we're going to do soon a nice little perhaps sutta study on giving and receiving admonishment. I'll put it on my notes. So then we can proceed with the sutta. The Buddha says, goes to the taints to be abandoned by avoiding, and says, what taints bhikkhus should be abandoned by avoiding? Here a bhikkhu reflecting wisely avoids a wild elephant, a wild horse, a wild bull, a wild dog, a snake, a stump, a bramble, patch, a chasm, a cliff, a cesspit, a sewer. Reflecting wisely, he avoids sitting on unsuitable seats, wandering to unsuitable resorts, and associating with bad friends. Since if he were to do so, wise companions in the holy life might suspect him of evil conduct. While taints, vexation, and fever might arise in one who does not avoid these things, there are no taints, vexation, and fever in one who avoids them. These are called the taints that should be abandoned by avoiding. So, in other words, actually, what the Buddha is suggesting to us is also not to do silly things, not to endanger ourselves as we're practicing, especially, if we get into monastics, into the blundering practices, we can, find all sorts of dangerous animals and put ourselves in all sorts of dangerous situations. And so the Buddha, in my understanding, he draws a sort of line. He draws a difference between encountering danger just because of the nature of, samsara. There will be things that are dangerous, and actually getting intentionally into a dangerous situation. So it's slightly different, right? And we can intentionally get into a dangerous situation because we can think that just by doing, just by being surrounded by wild elephants or wild horses or snakes, etc., then we're going to attain awakening. But in reality, actually, one can attain awakening, just in the safety of a little room. What really is important is what we do with our mind, not exactly what we're doing in terms of putting ourselves at risk. And so we don't, of course, want to have a nice balance in our practice where the practice is both challenging, but also not that challenging. So there's the famous, simile of the lute string. So we don't want it too loose, otherwise it won't make any sound, or too tight, otherwise it will break, right? And it's important we see not endanger ourselves, so avoiding certain places that we know are risky. Also certain animals, perhaps, if we see a snake, a poisonous snake, we can wish metta for that snake, but may that snake be happy and peaceful away from us. So we just, are wise enough to remove ourselves from the situation. This can also apply, by the way, to, people who are, mistreating us. So, for example, as we were talking earlier, when people are insulting us and so forth, well, we can endure it to a certain point and then leave. So we also want to avoid it altogether. If we know that there's someone who is abusive, instead of interacting with them on a regular basis and thinking, okay, I just need to endure this for the rest of my life. Well, actually, no, you endure it if you have no option. But if you have the option to leave, leave. And in this other section, the Buddha also, well, of course, he says about wandering to unsuitable resorts, which I think we just covered, but also he talks about avoiding sitting on unsuitable seats and associating with bad friends. So in other words, we can say his suggestion is not to distract ourselves, but also not to put ourselves in a sort of troubling situation. And then also in a situation where our spiritual companions might suspect of us, might be suspicious. So in other words, then that will create the conditions for disharmony with our spiritual companions, which is, not the best of situations, because as we know, the Buddha said, spiritual friendship is the entire path. So we want to be really as clean and as limpid as possible, as pure in our conduct, right? And make sure to avoid getting into trouble in the first place. So in other words, not doing things. Which, by the way, if you think about the instructions of the Buddha, most of the instructions of the Buddha are actually about not doing things, so not harming, not killing, not stealing. You can think, actually, I shouldn't just be doing anything, just stop doing what you're doing. And then you're already actually doing big chunk of the teachings, right? So we see how important it is to avoid sometimes doing something. So we don't need to patch up our mistakes. We don't need to have regret of it later. But rather, we actually eliminate the tendency of mind to get in trouble to begin with. And for, of course, all sorts of unwholesome mind states to appear in the mind. But once these mind states appear in the mind, what are we going to do? Well, the Buddha says, goes to the next section, taints to be abandoned by removing. So he says, what taints bhikkhus should be abandoned by removing? Here a bhikkhu, reflecting wisely, does not tolerate an arisen thought of sensual desire. He abandons it, removes it, does away with it, and annihilates it. He does not tolerate an arisen thought of ill will. He does not tolerate an arisen thought of cruelty. He does not tolerate arisen evil, unwholesome states. He abandons them, removes them, does away with them, and annihilates them. While taints, vexation, and fever might arise in one who does not remove these thoughts, there are no taints, vexation, or fever in one who removes them. These are called the taints that should be abandoned by removing. So it's very interesting because, it kind of sounds a little bit, in Western psychology, we have, I'm not an expert in Western psychology, actually, quite the opposite. But a lot of times, especially in Western circles, there is quite a bit of a mix of the teachings of the Buddha with Western psychology. And there's often, the encouragement also to see anger as like, wholesome, not a wholesome, perhaps like something that is very useful. Well, actually, throughout the suttas, the Buddha is pretty clear in highlighting the opposite. And, sometimes the instructions in the West are to, just, be with the anger, etc. But the Buddha here is quite clear, do not tolerate it. Of course, there is, we need to understand that in order to remove something, we need to understand what it is to begin with. But one thing is acknowledging I'm experiencing anger right now. This is the result of my actions in the past, and I'm not fueling it, and I'm waiting for it to disappear. Then another thing is saying, okay, this is natural. This is, something that is useful, and we're basically keeping on fueling it, keeping on nourishing it to one degree or the other, and not seeing how this. How anger is actually poisoning us, how anger is creating, vexations in the mind, creating unhappiness in the mind. So the Buddha, actually, it's really beautiful how he how he talks about this. There is, well, actually, maybe we can go through it in the next section. There's a beautiful sutta where he talks about when he was an unenlightened bodhisattva, and he goes through all these different states. And I have a quote here for you, but I think I'm going to read it later. It makes a little bit more sense. But yeah, fundamentally here, it's very important to highlight the right effort. So identifying these unwholesome states and then not tolerating them and removing them altogether. So this is a big, big ordeal, right? And in order to do that, we need to develop the skills to do it. This is also, by the way, part of right intention, So right intention, once again, is developing the intention of not doing certain things that we like to do. So like the intention not to harm, or non-ill will, non-violence, and the intention of renunciation, right? So lots of work to be done, which is why the Buddha gives us the instructions in the next and last section, which is called Taints to be abandoned by removing. So what taints bhikkhus should be abandoned by removing? Here, a bhikkhu reflecting wisely does not tolerate an arisen thought of sensual desire. Oh, I'm sorry. I actually just read that. Taints to be abandoned by developing, I meant. What taints bhikkhus should be abandoned by developing? Here, a bhikkhu reflecting wisely develops the mindfulness enlightenment factor, which is supported by seclusion, dispassion, and cessation, and ripens in relinquishment. He develops the investigation of states enlightenment factor, the energy enlightenment factor, the rapture enlightenment factor, the tranquility enlightenment factor, the concentration enlightenment factor, the equanimity enlightenment factor, which is supported by seclusion, dispassion, and cessation, and ripens in relinquishment. While taints, vexation, and fever might arise in one who does not develop these enlightenment factors, there are no taints, vexation, or fever in one who develops them. These are called the taints that should be abandoned by developing. So we get to fundamentally the instructions on the 7 factors of enlightenment, which, of course, as the name implies, they lead to enlightenment. So they lead to the final destination. And all of these, even though the instructions throughout the sutta seem to be kind of separate, they're all interconnected, as with all the teachings of the Buddha. And we see how developing these enlightenment factors also supports the rest of how to deal with all the different taints and different instructions that we have gone through so far in the sutta. It's very important to highlight how in order to develop and cultivate these enlightenment factors, one needs to have developed some virtues. So one needs to have developed at least the practice of the 5 precepts, so a basis through which we can actually develop and cultivate them, simply have the ability to do this. And on top of that, we need to do it intentionally. It's very important that we apply right effort when doing this. It's not sufficient just to wish to attain awakening or to wish to develop all of these factors, but rather we really need to roll up our sleeves if you have sleeves and work on it, work on the mind. And the Buddha also says that actually while we're developing and cultivating these factors, in the process, we're actually freed from greed, hatred, and delusion. Even when we're listening to the Dhamma, we're actually free, like with full intent. The 5 hindrances are not present in the mind. So there are these moments where we can actually have a taste of what it is to have an enlightened mind. Isn't that marvelous? Isn't that wonderful? And that's when we actually have the experience of the really peaceful mind. And that's why it's important to treasure those peaceful moments in our practice, those moments with, yeah, of really like having a good time in our mind, because that then propels us to keep on cultivating all of these factors, and then come to a point where they're not impermanent anymore. They're not just a state that comes and goes, but rather it's something that is permanent, because that's the only thing that actually is not subject to impermanence, is the deathless, is nibbana. So what are these factors of enlightenment? The first factor of enlightenment, as the Buddha says, is mindfulness, so sati. And how do we cultivate this? We cultivate it, I'm pretty sure that most of you are familiar with the four satipatthanas, the four foundations of mindfulness. So we don't have even slightly the right amount of time to go through the four foundations of mindfulness, but actually on our YouTube channel, there's a series taught by Bhante Sutaso that is very, very wonderful on exactly the four foundations of mindfulness. And I think we're going to do another series based on the suttas. I'm going to ask him, because it's always good to go back to it, and actually perhaps we can do some retreats on them. Excuse me. And then the second factor of enlightenment is the investigation of states, so Dhammavichaya. And fundamentally, the Buddha describes this as the capacity of discriminating whether a state is inferior or superior, wholesome or unwholesome, blameless or blameful, bright or dark, and so forth. There is a beautiful excerpt, which is the one that I was talking about earlier, that I think is very suitable to really illustrate the practice of this investigation of states. And it's in Majjhima Nikaya 19, where the Buddha describes when he's still an unenlightened bodhisattva. And I love whenever the Buddha talks about him being an unenlightened bodhisattva, because he's so relatable. Most of the time he's free from greed, hatred, and delusion, and we're like, we're never going to be the Buddha. But when the Buddha talks about him when he was, prior to his awakening, then he's very relatable. It's pretty much something that we're experiencing, and we're like, oh wow, even the Buddha was struggling with all these thoughts of greed, hatred, and delusion, but just like me. And so just like the Buddha, I can attain awakening too. Fills my heart with joy. And so the Buddha says, bhikkhus, before my enlightenment, while I was still only an unenlightened bodhisattva, it occurred to me, suppose that I divide my thoughts in two classes. Then I set on one side thoughts of sensual desires, thoughts of ill will, and thoughts of cruelty. And I set on the other side thoughts of renunciation, thoughts of non-ill will, and thoughts of non-cruelty. As I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute, a thought of sensual desire arose in me. I understood thus. This thought of sensual desire has arisen in me. This leads to my own affliction, to others' affliction, and to the affliction of both. It obstructs wisdom, causes difficulties, and leads away from nibbana. When I considered this leads to my own affliction, it subsided in me. When I considered this leads to others' affliction, it subsided in me. When I considered this leads to the affliction of both, it subsided in me. When I considered this obstructs wisdom, causes difficulties, and leads away from nibbana, it subsided in me. Whenever a thought of sensual desire arose in me, I abandoned it, I removed it, I did away with it. And then he does the same thing with ill will and cruelty and thoughts of cruelty. And so we see how beautiful this investigation of states, like how beautiful it is, and how powerful it is, and how skillful the Buddha is in describing what we need to do. And fundamentally, when we actually, start contemplating, we think that like meditation is having no thoughts at all, or having just trippy states, but rather actually this is a clear, for example, example of an active practice of meditation, of contemplation, where we're cultivating one of the factors of enlightenment that is extremely powerful and useful in order to make an impact on fundamentally our entire life. And that's once again seeing, it's also seeing dependent origination. So seeing how even a thought, let alone an action, can have such powerful consequences. So why would we entertain? We can think, oh yeah, I'm just thinking about having thoughts of sensual desire and thoughts of ill will and thoughts of cruelty. It's not really a big deal because I'm actually not acting upon them. But actually the Buddha tells us, well, you will eventually act upon them if you don't understand how dangerous these thoughts are. And so what is the inevitable consequence of these thoughts? It's leading to our affliction, leading to the development of more taints in the mind, of greed, hatred, and delusion, right? Or to others' affliction, if we keep on starting cultivating, oh, I hate that person, oh, that person is so awful, I hope that everything, the worst things can happen, and what goes around comes around, may they be tortured like they're torturing others, and so forth, right? Or like they tortured me, and I hope nobody is going to talk to them, and all sorts of thoughts we can have, right? So that's our own affliction because we're not happy while we're entertaining those thoughts. It's for the affliction of others because those people actually don't want to go through. Nobody wants to suffer, right? We don't want to suffer, and others don't want to suffer either. So then, we can see that it's for the affliction of both. So why would we do anything that is afflictive to anyone, whether it's ourselves or others, or both of us, which is most of the time? And this is an obstruction to wisdom we can contemplate. It causes difficulties and it leads away from nibbana, as the Buddha says. So we are backsliding in a really major way when we entertain these thoughts, when we don't remove these thoughts, when we don't do anything about it. And so that's how he says, when contemplating like this, then as soon as these thoughts arise in me, I abandon them, I remove them, I do away with them. So we say also that this is not a practice of repression, which I think it's why in connecting to what we were saying earlier about Western psychology, I think that's why they have that sort of wording in talking about anger, because normally we either, get anger to express in ourselves and foment, or we repress it. We have no middle way. But the Buddha instead is acknowledging that anger is there. He's not pretending, oh, it's not there, but presents us with some really skillful tools to remove it, to abandon it. And it is by actually contemplating cause and effect, contemplating the consequences of our actions with our thoughts alone. Very, very powerful, very skillful. Try it out actually when you're experiencing, especially obsessive thoughts. And by following these instructions and recollecting that also the Buddha has done it, you'll see an immediate relief and an immediate non-attachment to it. And this, of course, you can see how is very strongly connected to the third factor of enlightenment, virya, energy. So, constantly arousing ourselves based on Dhammavichaya, so what we just explained, what needs to be done, we develop this energy, really strong energy to do what needs to be done. Yeah, because we see how important it is, how we want to be happy and how we do not want suffering. And that requires effort, but it's actually like a joyful experience. It's not, just distress as we can think when we're thinking about putting so much effort into things. And this is, directly connected to the fourth factor of enlightenment, piti, so rapture. So when we start cultivating, all of these factors, cultivating meditation, and the pleasure that comes in actually dwelling with a happy mind, then we start cultivating a happiness that is not connected to sensual pleasures. And that is fundamental, to just keep making progress along the path. I wanted to share, I have another sutta quote actually from Majjhima Nikaya 14, still from the Buddha being an unenlightened bodhisattva, where he talks about how important, attaining this different sort of happiness is. And he says, before my enlightenment, while I was still only an unenlightened bodhisattva, I too clearly saw, as it actually is, with proper wisdom, how sensual pleasures provide little gratification, much suffering, and much despair, and how great is the danger in them. But as long as I still did not attain to the rapture and pleasure that are apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states, or to something more peaceful than that, I recognized that I still could be attracted to sensual pleasures. But when I clearly saw, as it actually is with proper wisdom, how sensual pleasures provide little gratification, much suffering, and much despair, and how great is the danger in them, and I attained to the rapture and pleasure that are apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states, or to something more peaceful than that, I recognized that I was no longer attracted to sensual pleasures. So with these beautiful words, the Buddha is fundamentally highlighting why, even though we see, the danger in sensual pleasures, we still, most of the time, take refuge into them. And of course, we take refuge is, like this, we shouldn't be taking refuge in it, but that's what fundamentally we do. But we should be kind with ourselves, understanding that we're unenlightened beings. And also the Buddha, before his enlightenment, would go towards them, would still find, kind of gratification in them, because, once again, he hadn't attained to the rapture and pleasure that are apart from sensual pleasures. So then you see that actually you see experientially, experientially that there is an alternative. You don't have to just intellectually think that, well, maybe there's something else besides the pleasantness of, having ice cream in the summer, right? I mean, yeah, I'm sure the Buddha says that, those monks say that. But this ice cream feels quite nice, it feels quite good, right? But when we start actually cultivating a different kind of pleasure that is not related to ice cream, that is not related to watching TV, that is not related to, just indulging in samsara, then the words of the Buddha start having a different flavor, different connotation. And by the way, as we cultivate meditation, then we start having some really pleasant states in meditation, which lead also to the cultivation of the fifth factor of enlightenment, tranquility, so passaddhi. And as we actually pay attention to this element of tranquility, we see that the mind soothes, and we actually remove restlessness in this way. Try it out in meditation whenever your mind is subject to the hindrance of restlessness. Just pay attention, focus the mind to the element of tranquility. So beautiful. I do it from time to time. Yeah, and in that way, you're also developing this mindfulness factor while also soothing and tranquilizing the mind even further. Which then creates great conditions, by the way, to cultivate and develop the mindfulness factor of samadhi. So, of course, there are different meditation practices of shamatha that are about paying attention to the sign of serenity, which stills the mind. And so we, instead of having a scattered mind, we have a still mind, concentrated mind. And so we can cultivate also the sign of non-dispersal. And by doing this, then we're able to create the supportive conditions to develop the last enlightenment factor of upekkha, equanimity, that we've been also talking about in the past couple of days as well. And upekkha, I really like the literal translation that Bhante Sutaso has offered in the past couple of months, of literally means seeing closely. And so when you see something closely, you see, like, for example, I'm looking at my hand right now. If I see it like this, I just see it like a sort of random shape of a hand. But if the more I see it closely, I see all the veins, I see all the little, how do you say, folds, all the little, I really understand better what the hand is. And then whenever we understand things, then the mind doesn't get shaken, doesn't get like weirded out. You know, we're like a scientist who sees closely, and a scientist then understands. So they're not shocked by things that happen, you know, in the world, because they fully understand them. All right, and then the sutta ends with, bhikkhus, when for a bhikkhu the taints that should be abandoned by seeing have been abandoned by seeing, when the taints that should be abandoned by restraining have been abandoned by restraining, when the taints that should be abandoned by using have been abandoned by using, when the taints that should be abandoned by enduring have been abandoned by enduring, when the taints that should be abandoned by avoiding have been abandoned by avoiding, when the taints that should be abandoned by removing have been abandoned by removing, when the taints that should be abandoned by developing have been abandoned by developing, then he is called the bhikkhu who dwells restrained with the restraint of all the taints. He has severed craving, flung off the fetters, and with the complete penetration of conceit, he has made an end of suffering. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. That is what the Blessed One said. The bhikkhus were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. I can say that I am too very, very, very happy. And I hope you are as well. All right, let's see if you have any questions or comments. In the meanwhile, I see that some other friends have joined us. Hello to Naval, good to see you. Gorgel, Gijini, Sue, great. Oh, Bhante Sudasi, good to see you. Blessings to you as well. And Anita asks, so Ayya, avoiding can unfold with a combination of metta and then back away. Without metta, this would be a seed of hatred, right? Don't quite understand. I don't think I understand your question, Anita. I'm sorry. So can you rephrase it? Maybe you said it actually while I was talking, and it was referred to something that I was saying, but I don't quite remember it right now. All right. And then I can't see. Gita says, Ayya, would it be possible to do the retreat online so that we could all participate with guidance from the Mahasangha? Yes, absolutely. Yeah. That's exactly what I was thinking. So Anita says the taint to avoiding. Yes, but I don't know what you're saying with metta. Oh, was it about the wild animals? Because is that possibly, let me get back to your question. Avoiding can unfold with a combination of metta and then back away. Without metta, this could be a seed of hatred. Oh, yes, exactly. Okay, now I understand. Yeah, so for example, with the poisonous snake, Absolutely. We can, we don't want to hate the snake. We don't want to hate any kind of sentient being that we encounter at all. But rather, what we want to do is, is may you be happy and healthy and peaceful away from me. So I think it's the Tibetans, but actually pretty much any any Buddhist tradition. But it seems to me that there's quite an emphasis in Mahayana anyway to also be kind in order to create the conditions for other sentient beings to be skillful. So you can think of it in terms of like you don't want the snake to make bad karma and attack you, right? So you can be kind. It's an act of kindness by preventing the poisonous snake to make an unwholesome action. In that way, you remove yourself from the situation. All right. And Michael says, I kindly talk a bit about the Pali for endure, which seems to have something to do with letting go. That's because endurance troubles me and that it seems to be an interim step on the way to equanimity, which I understand to be bringing the same mind to all conditions. What does interim mean? 1 second that I Google interim definition. Oh, provisional or temporary. So let me see if I understand your question. To understand. So, what is exactly your? Oh, maybe the connection is that where you're asking the connection between endurance, or the difference between endurance and equanimity. So, if I understand correctly, your question. How fundamentally endurance leads then to equanimity. It's fundamentally because we are, we're we're restraining our tendencies of mind of making a big fuss about everything and creating this kind of chaos in the mind, so to speak. So we tend to, perhaps. Actually, the clear example of this is in meditation practice, right? When if you even remember, if you've been meditating for a while, it's actually quite clear how different our experience right now it is than it was at the beginning of our practice. I remember when I first started meditating, after 10 minutes, I couldn't sit still. Right? And it felt like my body was falling apart and it was so painful, etc., etc. Then as time went by, I learned how to just sit still and not move, right? And it's not as if those sort of sensations weren't present or are not present anymore. They still are present. It's just that I've learned in the process on how to deal with it. So you're constantly pushing yourself further and further and developing equanimity, creating the conditions then to develop equanimity, because you're actually allowing yourself to really see what is pain. And when we start our meditation practice, the reason why we can't even bear 5 minutes of discomfort is because we don't understand what pain is. We have a thought, an idea of what pain is, and we grasp so hard to it. So as soon as we start experiencing discomfort, we don't want it. We start hating it. And the escape is to seek pleasant sensations, right? Look for, a state where we're not having an unpleasant physical experience. But instead, if we actually endure what can be endured, then we allow ourselves to really explore all of these, states of mind, such as question, what is pain? Question, what is hunger? If as soon as you're hungry, you open the fridge and you stuff yourself with food, then you're actually never really fully understanding what hunger is. And never understanding the difference between something that you need and something that you want, right? This is the biggest issue, especially these days, that there is a lot of economical prosperity throughout the world, and in particular in the United States of America, where we live, where at least I know you live, and where at least I live. There's a lot of material wealth in this country, and so it's, especially food is very cheap here, and it's readily and easily accessible. So then it's difficult to understand actually if the body needs to eat or the body wants to eat. And that's why we skip, we actually actively, in Buddhist practice, we allow ourselves to have times where we don't eat. And that is not to punish ourselves, but rather to create those conditions. It's not immoral, of course, to eat dinner, but rather what is great is that we create those conditions to actually see, oh, this is hunger. So I am right now needing, like I have this sensation of wanting to eat because I actually need to eat rice, I need to eat porridge, I need to eat whatever I need to eat because my body needs it in order to sustain itself. Or we see the difference, oh, look at that chocolate, I want that chocolate, I want that chocolate, I don't need that chocolate, but I definitely want it because I think it's going to make me happy. And yeah, this develops equanimity towards those sensations. Actually seeing, using, restraining, enduring, avoiding, all of it creates conditions for equanimity to arise in the mind, to fully understand our experience and then not act impulsively, instinctively out of it. And so fundamentally, we're letting go of all our unhelpful habitual tendencies that lead us towards suffering. So we're trying to rewire ourselves and actually create conditions for happiness rather than unhappiness. Very skilled at the latter, but not very much at the former. But the Buddha is, so we're very grateful that he is. And so, we have reached the end of the sutta, and I think actually it's worth also pointing out how, the very beginning of this series, Upasikatara had asked basically the difference between the asavas and the kilesas and how they were related. And we can see, I think that throughout this sutta, we can have this sense of how, fundamentally these asavas, so these taints, are, we can say, the toughest defilements, so to speak, right? And defilement as in translation for kilesa. But so it seems like it's out of these asavas, out of these taints, this is my understanding, all the rest of the defilements come into being. Right, so all the different, what the Buddha calls the vexations and fevers and what sort. So there are different nuances of suffering, fundamentally, that taint our experience. But by practicing in this way, the Buddha tells us, then actually full awakening is possible. But we need to really get to a full understanding of our mind and understanding what is the appropriate response in every single situation. And trying to not go, push too much in one extreme or the other. So not be too complacent and also not be too extreme. And Michael says, I hate something, but I endure it. That implies that hate is not abandoned, but tolerated. my idea is that English is faulty, but we needed to translate ideas. Yeah, I would say definitely, you know, with every translation, it's not the best translation. But you know, fundamentally, this is very much related to Kanti, so to patience, patient endurance. So that we tend to think that it is like gritting our teeth and going through it, but rather it's actually just lowering the bar of our expectations. So practicing contentment. So in that aspect, then we start, you know, letting go a lot of what we think is absolutely vital and necessary for our existence. So, you know, we've seen it also in the taints to be removed by using, right? So lodging, for example, or food or clothing or medicine, right? The 4 requisites. So we were talking about lowering the bar. Yeah. So then we are training ourselves to in a different type of patience, which is fundamentally being okay with being content with how things are right here, right now, in this moment. And so this applies also to the weather, whether it's raining or whether it's sunny, whether it's cold or whether it's hot. You know, whether there are different mosquitoes, animals, creatures that are creeping or pointing at us, or whether they're like outright, you know, harsh people, harsh words spoken at us. So we lower the bar of like, oh, well, I'm actually still okay. Yeah, it's totally fine. I can do this. It's really not a big deal. I'm content. I don't need much to be content. Yeah. And Kumu says, guess while enduring, the hate becomes deleted over time. Diluted, not deleted. Well, I hope it's going to become deleted over time. But yeah, well, I think that if hate, while we're doing that, if hatred appears in the mind, then we're actually, what we need to do is we're going to taints to be abandoned by removing, because we're having thoughts of ill will, thoughts of cruelty appearing in the mind, right? So that's when we need to remove those thoughts. This is why all of these, even though they're different instructions, they're given all at the same time, they're all interconnected. So endurance shouldn't be, you know, a lot of hatred, but rather, once again, that kind of balance or play of lowering our expectations and being happy with how things are. Hope that makes sense. You know, English is also not my first language, so we are the original language of the suttas is Pali. Then we're using English translations, and my first language is Italian, so it's like really interesting combination of things. But fundamentally, it's okay because the Dhamma is beyond words. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about Pali, or whether we're talking about English or Italian, or you name it. What is important is what we're doing with our mind. What's important is how are we practicing. What's important is, yeah, moving ahead and really seeing. Fundamentally, we can actually assess the quality of our practice by seeing our, you know, unwholesome states of mind increasing or decreasing. Am I happier or am I unhappier? Am I greedier? Am I more hateful? Am I more deluded than when I started? Or have these lessened and decreased over time? And so, of course, if, you know, if things have decreased over time, then we're on the right path. If we're happier, we're on the right path. When we're not, then we need to question our understanding of the teachings and correct what we're doing, so that then the results are in accordance to Dhamma. They're happy. Let's remember that the Buddha said that this path is beautiful at the beginning, in the middle, and in the end, right? So it has to be a path of happiness and peacefulness, and the people around us, need to also start seeing change in ourselves, seeing us becoming more wholesome, more pleasant to be around. If that's not the case, if we become grumpier when we go back to our family and we're only, great on retreat, then we're not practicing correctly. Sometimes we get people here at the monastery that they come like lay residents, and they're all like expecting for the monastery to be dead silent all the time, and for us to be just doing intensive meditation retreats. And instead they see perhaps people like families showing up being all loud with all the different children. And actually normally if someone is Asian born Buddhist, they already know, so they're completely okay. But if it's some Western converts who perhaps have like started in in like Western retreat centers, they're so like shocked, and they're like, oh, going to reprimand the lay people and becoming all upset. And it always makes me like smile, because I'm like, oh, it's so funny that we come to the monastery perhaps with all these ideas of doing a lot of meditation to become nicer and happier people, but then we get lost in such silly things, then as soon as we see someone who's actually kind of nice person, but perhaps they're talking a little bit too much for our taste, and then we're like, why are you doing here? You're supposed to be doing this and that. I'm like, well, we're missing the point. First and foremost, we should be nicer and sweeter, and then the intensive meditation practice will support us along the way. So yeah, if we're getting angry, or if we're getting if we're getting grumpier, then there's something that we need to adjust in our practice. Naval says, people around me tell me if I am so nice, it's difficult to survive in the world. I would say it's quite the opposite. It's difficult to survive in the world if we're a big jumble of great hatred and delusion, because we will be the first ones of not wanting to be around ourselves, right? That's where depression comes from in the mind. We're like, oh, this person is really unpleasant to be around with, but I have no other choice. I have no other option. We can decide not to see other people, but got to hang out with this one for, for quite some time. We have no option. So it better make, this home, the home of the mind, a comfortable one, rather than a place that, we can't wait to leave. All right. So I think that was... Gita says, our Gautama Buddha has given us all so many skillful methods to deal with all our defilements. We're most grateful. Yes, sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. I am definitely so grateful to the Buddha. It is just marvelous. The Dhamma is the most beautiful thing I've ever encountered in my life, and the only one that leads to happiness. Yeah. So we can rejoice in our good karma that has brought us to this incredible destination of having the teachings of the Buddha, being interested in them, and being willing to practice them. These are all incredibly special conditions. So on that note, we can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. May you all be well, happy, and peaceful. So this evening we will be meeting again with Bhante Sudaso at 7:30 p.m. for monk chat, because they will be all out of the retreat. And so Not sure if Tangang will be with us tonight, but it might be. But in any case, next week, actually tomorrow, we'll have Bhante Sanata Vihari coming to visit, and after a couple of days, Ayya Sudina, who's a senior female monk from Sri Lanka, senior bhikkhuni from Sri Lanka, is coming to visit Empty Cloud for a week. Yeah, Bhante Sanata Vihari will be staying with us for a couple of weeks. And after that, we'll have Venerable Vimalanyani arriving from Sri Lanka, and Bhante Sumita coming back to Empty Cloud, and they will both be staying with us for the entire Vasa. So you'll be seeing a lot of them throughout the summer. All right, so keep tuned. And this weekend, if you're around the monastery, tomorrow at 6 p.m. we'll have meditation on the lawn as usual. And on Sunday, there is family day. So you're welcome to bring your entire family to the monastery, listen to some good Dhamma, share food with the monastic Sangha, and yeah, and meet spiritual friends. All right, may you all be well and happy and peaceful.